I think it would be very useful at this stage to get an Irish perspective, and there really isn't anyone better suited to do that than Dr. Ewan Mullins, Senior Research Officer at Teagasc. Ewan began his academic career in Maynooth. He did his BSc there and did his PhD at UCC, but he spent quite a number of years in the United States working for the USDA Horticulture Research Laboratory in Florida, and then at Penn State, where he was heavily involved in Arabidopsis. I should be able to pronounce that because I've actually done a bit of work on that myself, modestly so. But he's also, importantly, been involved with the Amiga program, which I think many of you will be familiar with. It's, I think, now into its last year. And it's done very important work on monitoring the impact on the agri-environment of a GM potato with late blight resistance. Could I just, as Ewan comes to the podium, remind you of our Twitter hashtag. It's hashtag TeagascLS for a lecture series, if you would like to make any comments. And Ewan, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to keep this very brief. I suppose after listening to that, you're very humbled, because when I was given the task 2 weeks ago of excuse me, basically trying to give context from an Irish perspective to what Ford is presenting and what's in the book, I was a bit daunted, to say the least. The first thing I had to do, obviously, was read the book, and I really enjoyed doing that in the last 2 to 3 weeks, a lot more of it last night. But it's interesting, I suppose, when you read the book. I should say I'm a biotechnologist, and basically when you read through the book, I suppose you start to go through a range of emotions. For example, some of the earlier comments about biotechnology, you felt a little bit almost offended. Of course, it was naivety, really. And then as you get into the book, you actually evolved. So it's very interesting. We've had a talk tonight about evolution and how we need to evolve our science, but actually evolving our thoughts and how we think about the problems we face and how we can tackle them, I think, is even more important. You have to ask the question, though, can natural selection and evolution cope with what we face as a species? Can it cope with the challenges we face today in our agricultural systems and our food production systems? We all know about climate change. There are fantastic models that have been produced and published, put into non-scientific language so everybody can understand them. And the outputs from those models are, to be frank, quite scary. And it's not understating it when you see the challenges we face in our cropping systems, even here in Ireland, because it's not just climate change. We have legislative challenges. We're being tasked by Europe to reduce the amount of pesticides we use and the class of chemicals we use on our crop production systems. So obviously that makes perfect sense, because no farmer likes to spray, and we want to minimize the amount of chemicals we put out in the land. But how are we going to produce food if we can't, because of the dependency we have on agri-chemicals? We have to break that link. So how can we do that? We know basically from work we've done with colleagues in UCD, Fiona Doon, and ourselves in Oak Park, we know that crop pathogens have a greater capacity to evolve to climate change than crops do. Septoria, Fusarium, they don't mind living in a high CO2 environment. In fact, our studies show that they'll do much better in it. So these are issues that we have to be aware of as we go forward. The question is, how are we going to tackle them? We can change our preferences. We can change how we produce our food, what food we want to eat. When you read Ford's book, you'll see, I think it was in the first chapter, he has all these fantastic statistics about the fact that there's enough grain-based commodities in the world to feed everybody. However, that assumes we all stop eating meat. So obviously that's not going to happen. But we have to reassess how we're going to address the challenges we have. And I suppose Leo just mentioned the Amiga project we have, and that really is a classic trade-off experiment. The Amiga project is focusing on the use of cisgenics. Now, we heard tonight about the agri-biotech industry and drought tolerance. But obviously we all know about blight disease in potato. It's historically and socially important, but it's still a main disease we have in our potato systems today. And when we use potatoes in Ireland, we spray 15, 17, 18 times a year, and we almost accept it as a population because it has to be done to get our potato crop out of the ground. However, cisgenics is a form of GM it's basically taking a gene from a wild species and putting it into a conventional species. And what you're doing, in effect, is accelerating breeding. So we know that evolution is not going to keep up with the challenges we face. So we have to use alternatives to help us meet our production systems. Now, whether this is the approach we should take or not, we don't know. That's why we're doing the research. But there's a distinction between a natural ecosystem, and we heard tonight about basically evolution and natural selection from a natural system, and how, and if you read the book, how especially there's fantastic examples of forestry evolution and how trees adapt. But there's a very large distinction between a natural ecosystem and an agricultural ecosystem. An agricultural ecosystem is designed, obviously, to produce. And we have to be aware of that. And in Oak Park, we've done work on oilseed rape. If you're not familiar with it, obviously it's a very recognizable yellow flower in springtime, a very important break crop in our tillage systems. And we know that basically if you have more flowers, you'll get more bees, you'll get more what we call diversity, I suppose, in a field. But more flowers will not lead to more production. It'll lead to a decrease in production because basically too many flowers prevent light penetration going down into the leaves, and that basically puts a halt on filling the seed in the pods. So sometimes getting the balance between natural ecosystems and agricultural ecosystems, we have to keep an eye on what the end goal is. Now, to do that, obviously, there was a very illuminating talk last summer here at the EPSO meeting down in the conference centre in Dublin. EPSO is European Plant Science Organisation. Every 4 years, thousands of plant scientists get together. And Steve Long from the University of Illinois stated at the start of his talk, it was after lunch, the graveyard shift, people were probably settling in for a snooze because they're very comfortable seats down there. But basically he started out by saying, at the moment, photosynthetic capacity is produced on average increased on average about 1% per decade. And we need to increase it by 30% by 2050. And that certainly got people's attention. So it's very important that if we are to keep pace with food production, we know that there are no simple single solutions to address it. As Ford has pointed out, we need to look at all systems, be they organic, conventional, biotechnology-based systems. We can't ignore anything. And it's true that we don't have the luxury to ignore one system, and neither should we adopt them without considering all the trade-offs. With the Amiga project, whereas we're looking at the impact of a cisgene, a GM trait in a potato crop, we're looking at the trade-off under the soil. What's going to be the impact on soil microbes and soil bacteria and fungi? So to end, if you ever find yourself in London, in the Natural History Museum, there's a fantastic foyer there, beautiful, and you make your way up through the foyer, and at the top of the stairs, there's Charles Darwin sitting up there. And underneath there, there's a plaque that says, "The freedom of thought is best promoted by the gradual illumination of people's minds, which follow from the advance of science." Now, if we're going to meet the challenges we have to face in the next few years, we have to focus on the advance of science, not the advance of one particular system, but the advance of multiple systems as a whole. And I think Ford's talk tonight has enlightened me personally. I hope the team in Oak Park who heard his talk this afternoon and those of you who are here today will feel the same. Because it's very important as we go forward that we acknowledge the challenges we face, but we don't eliminate any particular system based on an ideology, that we base our decisions on scientific fact. So, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much. So I wanted to open this up now for a general discussion for a short period. Ewan has added, as I said, an Irish perspective to all of this. And you'll have to bear with me because the lights here on the stage are quite bright, so I may have some trouble catching people. You'll need to make it clear that you want to make a contribution. So would anyone like to kick off the conversation? I have somebody offering over. Actually, I'll come to you in a moment. This gentleman here.
Hi, thanks for that great talk. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about selection mechanisms. Talked a lot about agronomic selection, so drought tolerance, flood tolerance, but I'm quite interested in cultural selection as well. how much of the literature is looking at that? And I'm thinking particularly of mutation breeding, which was largely a failure, as a whole form of plant breeding research, except for the Rio Star grapefruit, which consumers like because it's more red. How do these sort of cultural preferences play into how you're thinking about cisgenesis, transgenesis, or other agricultural processes you might implement in the future?
Well, certainly there's a lot of, I think there are some concerns about biotechnology. My main focus really is not on risks, but on sort of overpromising, at least short-term overpromising. But it's also clear that these are really powerful tools that have, great potential for making improvements. In cases where, let's take any of the examples that I gave where there's potential for an improvement. That could be done perhaps through some selection, crosses and so on, but it could also perhaps be done through some CRISPR, modification if we know what the genes are, for example. And yet it's obvious that there's public opposition that is, to put it mildly, not entirely rational. So I think that's unfortunate. If somebody wants to quote me as, Professor Denison says biotechnology should not be banned, feel free to do that. There are a lot of great stories about cultural selection. When I took the plant breeding course at Cornell, Dr. Henry Munger told us these stories about this wonderful melon that he had. It was just fantastic. And he picked it up in a French plant breeding lab. They were throwing it away because this muskmelon had a net pattern on the surface, which is considered a desirable trait in the US. I don't know about here, but in France, nobody would buy that. And so even though it had disease resistance, great flavor, and so on, they were about to throw it away. And I hope that's not the fate of useful biotechnology as well.
Okay, there was a gentleman over here. Could you just hold on for the microphone, please, just for a moment?
Thank you very much, Professor, and also Ewan for your comments. I am an agricultural graduate of some 40 years. When I went through the college system, the word organic was not mentioned in the Irish university sector. I regret that. I had to travel abroad to learn about organic methods. I spent 40 years teaching organic methods, and I want to ask both of the speakers tonight, do you think we have got the balance right? Would Darwin be pleased at the long-term effect and the short-term effects and consequences? We focused on evolution tonight, a very illuminating talk, but I think that is the major question. Have we got that balance right between organic and biotech? Because as a grower, I'm crying out for organic systems, for natural systems to help me with my plants. Thank you.
We have to ask whether organic farming is a model for all of agriculture, the wave of the future, or whether it's a niche market like kosher food. Because the answer to that question will have very profound implications. If it's a niche market, then, whatever people say is organic, whether it makes any sense or not, whether it decreases pollution or not, that's what they want, and you follow those rules, and that's organic. In the same way that, maybe pork is not as dangerous as it used to be when kosher rules were first formed. On the other hand, if organic is potentially the wave of the future, then we have to apply a more rational criteria to this. And, my brother's an organic farmer. He's a really good farmer. always learn a lot talking to him. And so I think we could then, kind of look at organic farming a couple of ways. If we see it as a model for all of agriculture, we've got a problem. Because the typical organic farms, and I've seen data on this from various places, they're heavily reliant for their nutrient supply from a subsidy from an industrial agriculture, manure coming from other farms, or grain coming from conventional farms being fed to, cattle that are then producing the manure for fertilization. And one of the slides that I didn't get a chance to show today, I have kind of this path of nitrogen from synthetic fertilizer on 4 hectares in the Midwest, traveling to chicken farms in Alabama, and then producing enough manure to fertilize 1 hectare of organic land. So based on that, nitrogen balance, you could never have more than 20% of your land in organic farming getting, this nutrient subsidy from the rest of agriculture. But that assumes, organic that's based on manure rather than organic that's based on nitrogen fixation, for example. In the US, we're way below 20%. We're like at 1 or 2% of the land is in organic farms. And that is kind of an interesting implication. That means that if 2% of your land is in organic farms, and if you make the assumption that organic farming causes 0 pollution, then doubling the area of organic farms would have this negligible effect on pollution, whereas a 10% reduction in fertilizer use or pesticide use by the 98% of the landscape would have a big effect on pollution. That suggests then that the value of organic farms perhaps is not just the wildlife that they support or the reduced pesticide flux that's coming from the organic farms relative to conventional farms, but rather they're a potential source of ideas for how to improve all of agriculture. Not necessarily adopting everything that's in the organic standard, unless the organic standard is subject to revision based on scientific findings. But if I were looking for ideas to improve a crop, I wouldn't look at just one of its wild relatives. I would look at a bunch of its wild relatives. If I were looking to improve agriculture, I wouldn't just study the Irish educational system. I would study many educational systems around the world. And so in that sense, if, let's say, 20% of the good ideas to improve agriculture are to be found on organic farms, they're really fighting above their weight, punching above their weight, or important beyond their 2% of land area. And that's the way I see it, as a place where we try interesting things, and potentially that makes contributions that could transform all of agriculture, but not necessarily involving all of agriculture copying organic completely. Did you want to? That was kind of a long answer. Sorry about that.
No, I think you answered my thoughts. Sorry, is this on?
Yeah, it should be working.
Yeah. I suppose what's been very interesting for me in the last 3 years with the Amiga project is how insightful it has been in regards to the public debate side of issues. I've met many organic growers and spoken to many organic groups, and it's clear that, as I said there, that there's not one system that should have a monopoly on how to produce food, basically. I don't believe we can dismiss anything. And I've learned many things from going to organic farmers in that regard. And when you're meeting the organic farmers, they're throwing ideas out. And actually, one of the ideas an organic farmer gave me was probably one of the underlying foundations for the Amiga project from our participation in it. It just triggered a question in my head about what's going on in the soil. Your question about the balance, do we have the right balance now? No, I don't think we do. But I think we need to be constantly reassessing it, because I don't think we can preclude the idea that systems can coexist. There's a notion that, for example, organic can't coexist with GM, and GM won't coexist with conventional and stuff like this. These are sort of generic debating points that need to be dismissed out of hand, because really it comes down to the biology of the crop that we're talking about. And when we have these discussions, we do need to be much more specific about the facts that we're talking about. But it's interesting, you asked what would Darwin think about where we are now. I wonder what would Darwin think about the challenges we face now. Would he ever have thought about those? If he did, I wonder what his answer would be to your question. So.
Yeah, if we want organic to be a very widespread thing, then the issue of the use of transgenics in organic would have to be based on scientific criteria and not just ideology.
Okay, we've
Certainly, I enjoyed your talk, Professor. Very interesting talk regarding GM technology and biotech crops. In Europe, you're probably aware that we have sort of buried our heads in the sand. And for example, for the last 14 months, the EU Commission had made no decision on the importation of 14, it's now 17 different crop events like soybeans and maize, which is so important. We have a huge deficiency of protein, animal protein to feed our animals in the European Union, and yet at a political decision, decisions haven't been made. And Irish farmers in particular, if decisions aren't made soon, Ireland Inc. will suffer badly. And the other thing that's come down the line, and which is of paramount importance as well, is the new events of plant breeding, the new techniques of plant breeding, and indeed the new techniques of genetics. You mentioned one of them there, CRISPR-Cas, the new gene editing techniques, and the big question again in the European Union, how are we going to regulate those techniques? And indeed, a decision has been awaited. The Commission have been pondering this for the last 2 or 3 years. No decisions have been made. Yes, yet in other jurisdictions like in North America, South America, they're deregulating, because why? A lot of those techniques, they're not transgenic, and they will not be, you can produce a plant, you can turn a gene on or off in a plant, and we will not be able to identify the final product because there's no new DNA protein in those products. So I think this is huge importance for the European Union and for Ireland Inc. going forward. And indeed, policymakers, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but really I think we could be left behind. And I think Dr. Mullins alluded to there, the Commission are banning a lot of plant protection products, but with climate change, how are we going to fend or protect our crops against those pathogens if we don't use modern genetics, modern biotechnology? Thank you.
So I would, this may be wishful thinking or unrealistic, I would like to see decisions about biotechnology made by scientific groups, but those scientific groups should not be just molecular biologists, it should also include ecologists. And so as an example of that, the Bt toxin that's used to protect crops from insects appears to be relatively durable. We haven't had that many examples, that much of a problem with insects evolving Bt resistance, because when that was first introduced, they brought in evolutionary biologists and designed this strategy, this high-dose refuge strategy for slowing the evolution of insect pest resistance to Bt. On the other hand, when Monsanto introduced their herbicide-resistant, Roundup-resistant materials, they just basically put them out there and didn't have an effective system in place for slowing the evolution of weeds in evolving resistance to glyphosate or Roundup. And as a result, the farmers that used that materials, many of them came to rely very heavily on glyphosate as their sole weed control or almost their sole weed control. that created conditions where there was strong selection for resistance to glyphosate, and now many parts of the United States, Roundup-resistant weeds are a really serious problem. So that's something that if that initial approval of the release of Roundup-ready crops on that panel had ecologists and evolutionary biologists, we wouldn't have that problem today where we're now having to start using more toxic herbicides than glyphosate because of this failure to consider the evolutionary issues.
I think I just reiterate that, because many of the times when you're having a public discussion about GM, the issue of superweeds or herbicide-tolerant weeds comes up, and you find yourself trying to explain the concepts around it, but not many people know is that we actually have these so-called herbicide-tolerant superweeds here in Ireland. We don't grow any GM crops in Ireland, but basically it's down to the misuse of chemicals, reliance on single chemistries, just like we have antibiotic-resistant bugs in our hospitals, etc. If you don't integrate management systems and mix things up a bit, this is what will happen. But the problem here, of course, is that this captures the headlines, and unfortunately it reiterates the issues and the thought processes in the public mind that GM, which is effectively just an umbrella term for multiple technologies, is to preserve of the ag-biotech industry, which indeed is not the case. It is just a technology, and as the speaker or the gentleman in the back talked about it, we have newer technologies such as CRISPR-Cas, which are genome editing strategies, which do not require the insertion of any genetic material in a plant. You're effectively using proteins to act as a molecular scissors, and you go in and you can make little cuts in the DNA, and they leave no trace behind. So the technology is advancing at a huge pace, and it's not keeping pace with policy, which would be a cause of grave concern.
Okay, I'm going to take two comments. I'll take Jerry last, if you don't mind, Jerry, just to finish off. And then we'll hear from Dr. Noel Cawley, who's going to thank our speaker. But I'll take a comment from here, yep.
Yes, the question was put, well, first of all, thank you for a very good presentation. The question was put, what would Charles Darwin think if he was to be about now? Most likely he would be flabbergasted at the levels of biodiversity loss. And I think it's also appreciated that there's a huge amount that we do not know about soil science. And there was also a point made earlier about nutritional sustainability. And if the education system for secondary school or agricultural science students is telling them that you must spray off your potatoes before you harvest them, and it helps to strengthen the skin of the potato, but it doesn't pose the question, what is the harm for the consumer? Is this going to be nutritional sustainability? Society seems to be getting sicker. So we have to see a bigger picture. And I might remind you that biodiversity builds resilience, and there's scientific evidence for that. Thank you.
Okay. Could you repeat his main points? I got biodiversity and nutritional thing, but I didn't get all of what he said. Or do you want to try again?
I surely do, yeah.
Maybe briefly state your main question.
Well, my point was, the question was posed, what would Charles Darwin say if he was to find himself here now today? And my point was that he would be flabbergasted at biodiversity loss.
Biodiversity loss, yes.
And the other point I made was, right, we're trying new technologies. There's a huge amount we do not know about soil science. My other point related to nutritional sustainability and the education system promoting that the potatoes get sprayed 15 to 17 times. I grow organic potatoes with no sprays. So we need to illuminate people's minds in a fair and balanced way.
I think if you're growing potatoes with no sprays, that would be an example of what I said earlier, that we may have a lot to learn from organic farming. Biodiversity loss, I think, is a concern that's shared by people who support biotechnology and people who oppose biotechnology. These are, I mean, this cisgenic potato, for example, which has genes from potato inserted, not from some other species, that's from some wild potato, right? Yeah. So if those wild potatoes had gone extinct, these disease resistance genes would have been lost. So preserving biodiversity is a very important priority, I think, for all of us.
Just on the point of education, I think you're dead right. It's interesting to note that some of the biggest criticisms we received were actually from conventional growers who criticized me, not in an email, but more face-to-face, for basically telling people about how much fungicide we spray on our potato crops. So it's an interesting concept because basically I agree we have to inform the public more about our food production systems, but it has to be balanced about the challenges we face as well as the opportunities that we have to tackle them as well.
Okay, well, my thanks to both speakers and to all of you. I'm going to call now on Jerry Boyle, the director of Teagasc, to thank our speaker formally.
I just want to, first of all, thank Ford, Professor Denison, for a really stimulating talk. I'm not a biologist, as you all know and probably have guessed by now, but I did read your book about a year ago, and it was one of the most stimulating books I think I've read in a long time. And I think I took some very positive messages from your book. There's a certain, obviously we talk about natural selection, certain inevitability about natural selection, but the message I took from your book is that mankind can also intervene very positively by establishing very creative systems of food production. And we have done that in many parts of the world. And we have done that in Ireland. I mean, I'm very proud to say in our own institute, we have emphasized the importance of establishing and testing systems of production. And that's one message, certainly, that I took from very strong and powerful and positive message from your book. I'd like to thank you for your presentation and indeed for your visit to Oak Park this afternoon. I want to thank all of you for attending, and as a small token of our appreciation, we'd like to make you a gift of memento of your visit here to Ireland and of your talk here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Shall I hold it up? Show people what it is? Oh, okay. Thank you. Oh, great.
Thanks very much, Jerry. Agus Garamai with Galer, Choctan Shaw Nucht, Agus Slán, Agus Banach Dív Galer. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.